I heard my son speaking to Palestinians on that old rotary phone, his voice low and urgent in the darkness of our Queens apartment. That single conversation would cost him his inheritance. And it would cost me everything I thought I knew about love. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Elena, and I am 73 years old. Every morning at 5:30, before the sun touches the brick buildings of Astoria, I wake to the sound of garbage trucks grinding their way down Northern Boulevard. The smell of lukewarm coffee mingles with the exhaust fumes that seep through my kitchen window, the one that overlooks the fire escape where pigeons nest in the rusted railings. My routine has been the same for 27 years. First, I brew coffee in the same aluminum pot my mother brought from the old country. Then I wash the dishes from the night before, always the same chipped plates with the faded roses that have survived 3 generations of our family. I dust the photographs on the mantel above my worn burgundy couch, faces of children who once ran through these rooms with sticky fingers and endless laughter. But that Tuesday evening in October, as I set the dinner table with those familiar plates, expecting no one to come eat with me, the phone rang. Not the cell phone my daughter bought me last Christmas that I still struggle to use, but the heavy black rotary phone that sits on the small table by my bedroom window. The phone that has witnessed 30 years of birthday calls, emergency room visits, and whispered confessions in the dark. I picked up the receiver, expecting maybe Ruth from downstairs complaining about the water pressure again. Instead, I heard the crackling static of a long-distance call, and then my son David's voice. But he wasn't speaking to me. He was speaking Arabic. I held my breath, pressing the receiver closer to my ear. My heart hammered against my ribs as I listened to words I couldn't understand, but the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. He was speaking to someone far away, someone whose voice carried the weight of desperation even through the static. Palestinian names floated through the conversation like prayers I'd never learned to say. For 47 years, I had raised David with my own hands. I sewed his school clothes on the Singer sewing machine that still sits in the corner of my bedroom. I walked him to PS 122 on those bitter winter mornings when the snow piled high against the storefronts on Ditmars Boulevard. I worked double shifts at Queens General Hospital, cleaning floors until my knees screamed and my back curved like a question mark, just so he could have piano lessons and baseball cleats and a chance at something better than what I had. And now, in the quietness of my small apartment, listening to him speak passionately to strangers on the other side of the world about causes I didn't understand, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet like an earthquake that no one else could feel. I thought about the photograph hanging above my couch. David at 7 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, his arm around his younger sister Maria, both of them covered in chocolate from the ice cream truck that used to come down our street playing that tinkling melody that made all the children run. I could still smell the faint trace of his cologne on the jacket he left hanging in my hall closet 3 months ago, after our last fight about money, about priorities, about what family means. That night, after I hung up the phone without saying a word, I sat in my kitchen staring at the 2-play settings I had arranged out of habit. The expectation that maybe, just maybe, someone would come home for dinner. The reality that I was alone, again, with my thoughts and the distant hum of the subway running beneath the streets like the heartbeat of a city that never stops moving. I wondered how we had come to this place, this distance between a mother and her son that felt wider than the ocean separating us from the people he was trying to help. When did loving someone become a burden they wanted to escape? When did sacrifice become manipulation in their eyes? Let me tell you about the 27 years of sacrifice that brought us to that phone call. I came to America when David was 2 years old, carrying him on my hip in a single suitcase filled with photographs and the few pieces of jewelry my grandmother had pressed into my hands before we left. My husband Miguel had already been in Queens for 8 months, working construction in Manhattan and sleeping on his cousin's couch, sending every dollar he could spare back to us. Our first apartment was a studio in Elmhurst with peeling wallpaper and radiators that clanged like ghosts in chains all through the winter nights. But it was ours. Miguel worked construction during the day and stocked shelves at the grocery store at night. I cleaned office buildings in Midtown, taking the 7 train at midnight and returning home at dawn, my hands raw from industrial cleaning solutions and my feet swollen from walking miles of corporate hallways. David would wake up as I came through the door, reaching his small arms toward me from the crib Miguel had found abandoned on the street and painted bright blue. I would hold him close, smelling the sweet warmth of his hair, and whisper promises about the life we were building for him. A life where he would never have to clean other people's messes or bow his head to bosses who treated him like he was invisible. When Maria was born 3 years later, I was working the night shift at Queens General Hospital. The same hospital where I would eventually spend 23 years mopping floors, emptying trash bins, and scrubbing toilets until my reflection in those institutional mirrors looked like a stranger I barely recognized. Miguel's back gave out when David was 12, a construction accident that left him with a permanent limp and a settlement check that disappeared into medical bills and physical therapy appointments that insurance wouldn't cover. So it was just me, working 16-hour days to keep our family afloat. David was smart, smarter than both Miguel and me put together. His teachers called him gifted, a word that filled me with fierce pride and bone-deep terror in equal measure. How do you nurture a gift when you're barely keeping the lights on? I remember the night David came home from high school with college brochures spread across our kitchen table like a map to a country I'd never seen. Columbia University, NYU, schools with names that sounded like dreams I'd never dared to have for myself. He was 17, tall and serious, his dark eyes bright with possibilities that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon of our small world in Queens. "Mommy," he said, using the name he would later abandon as too childish, too ethnic, too much a reminder of where we came from. "I want to study international relations. I want to help people." I worked 3 jobs that year to help pay for his college applications. Cleaning the hospital at night, doing laundry for wealthy families in Forest Hills during the day, and babysitting for our neighbors on weekends. My hands were never clean, always smelling of bleach and other people's children. But when that acceptance letter came from Columbia, when I saw my son's name printed on that thick cream-colored paper, I cried until my eyes burned. Miguel was proud but worried. "He's getting ideas above his station," he would say in Spanish when he thought David couldn't hear. "Education is good, but he needs to remember where he comes from, who he belongs to." David threw himself into his studies with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened me. He would come home during breaks speaking about things I couldn't understand. Global politics, human rights, social justice movements that spanned continents. He spoke with the passionate certainty of young people who believe they can change the world, and I loved him for it even as it scared me. Because change meant leaving things behind. And I was terrified that what he would leave behind was us. During his junior year, David started bringing home friends whose names I couldn't pronounce and whose parents were professors and diplomats and people who had never cleaned a floor in their lives. They would sit around our kitchen table, eating the rice and beans I cooked for them while discussing conflicts in countries I'd only heard about on the evening news. That's when I first heard him mention Palestine. Not as a place on a map, but as a cause that seemed to ignite something fierce and beautiful in his eyes. He talked about occupation and resistance, about the moral obligation to stand with the oppressed, about how comfortable Americans turned away from uncomfortable truths happening in other people's homelands. "But what about your own homeland?" I wanted to ask. "What about the woman who sacrificed everything so you could have the luxury of caring about strangers on the other side of the world?" Instead, I nodded and served him more rice, because that's what mothers do. We swallow our fears and feed our children's dreams, even when those dreams feel like they're pulling them away from us. After college, David got a job at a nonprofit organization in Manhattan that worked on international human rights issues. The pay was terrible, barely enough to cover rent on a tiny apartment in Brooklyn that cost more than Miguel and I spent on our entire monthly budget. So of course, I helped. What mother wouldn't? I paid his security deposit when he couldn't afford it. I slipped him grocery money when I knew he was eating nothing but ramen noodles and pride. When his student loan payments started, I took on extra weekend work cleaning houses in Bayside so I could help him manage the debt that threatened to crush his idealistic dreams. "It's temporary, Mommy," he would tell me, using the old endearment when he needed something. "Just until I get established. Just until the organization gets more funding. Just until things get better." But things never got better. They got more complicated. David started traveling for work. First to conferences in Washington, D.C. and Chicago, then to places that sounded like they existed only in newspaper headlines. Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt. He would call me from airport terminals at odd hours, his voice crackling through international connections that cost him money he didn't have but spent anyway. "I'm doing important work, Mommy," he would say. "I'm documenting human rights abuses. I'm giving voice to people who have been silenced." And I was proud. Terrified, but proud. My son, the boy I had carried on my hip through the immigration office, was trying to heal the world's wounds. How could I not be proud? But pride is a complicated emotion when it comes with the price of being forgotten. Birthdays started slipping by unnoticed. Mother's Day became a rushed phone call if I was lucky, a text message if I wasn't. When I had surgery to remove gallstones 2 years ago, David was in Ramallah documenting testimonies from families whose homes had been demolished. Maria, now grown with children of her own, had to drive me to the hospital and hold my hand through the recovery. "He's saving the world, Mama," she told me gently when I complained about his absence. "That's what you raised him to do, isn't it?" But I didn't raise him to save the world. I raised him to save himself, to build a life better than the one Miguel and I could give him. And maybe, selfishly, I hoped he would save me too. From the loneliness of being the mother who sacrificed everything and received silence in return. The phone calls became less frequent but more intense. When David did call, he talked about his work with a passion that made his voice shake. He told me about families living in refugee camps for generations, about children who had never seen the villages their grandparents still called home, about a conflict so complex and painful that it seemed to consume everyone it touched. I'm falling in love with someone, he told me during one of these calls, about 8 months ago. Her name is Layla. She's a human rights lawyer. She's Palestinian American, and she's the smartest, bravest person I've ever met. I should have been happy for him. Any mother should be happy to hear that her son has found love. But something cold settled in my chest as he described this woman who shared his passion for a cause that seemed to be pulling him further and further away from the family that had made his passion possible. When will you bring her home to meet us? I asked. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the sounds of traffic in the background, the urban symphony of a life I wasn't part of. Soon, Mommy. When things settle down a bit. When she's not so busy with her cases. But soon never came. Instead, the phone calls became conversations about injustice and activism, about fundraising events and protest marches, about everything except the woman who had raised him and the family who missed him. Miguel started making bitter comments about our important son who was too busy saving strangers to visit his own parents. He's forgotten who he is, Miguel would say, his voice heavy with disappointment and something that sounded like grief. He's forgotten where he came from. Maria tried to defend her brother, but even she started to sound strained when she talked about David's absence from family gatherings, his missed phone calls, the way he seemed to exist in a world that had no room for the people who had loved him first. It was Ruth from downstairs who first planted the seed of doubt that would grow into the painful realization I didn't want to face. Elena, sweetheart, she said one afternoon as we sat on the stoop watching the children from the Dominican family next door play hopscotch on the sidewalk. When was the last time that son of yours asked about you? Really asked, I mean. Not just how you're doing, but what you're thinking about, what you need, what would make you happy. I started to answer and realized I couldn't remember. He calls, I said weakly. About his problems. About his work. About what he needs from you. Ruth's voice was gentle but uncompromising. But when was the last time he called just to hear your voice? That question haunted me for weeks. I found myself replaying our conversations, analyzing the words he used, the tone of his voice, the things he asked about and the things he never mentioned. I realized that somewhere along the way, our relationship had become a one-way transaction. I gave support, encouragement, money, understanding, forgiveness. He took what he needed and disappeared back into his important work, his meaningful life, his quest to save everyone except the woman who had saved him first. The breaking point came on a cold Thursday evening in March. I had been battling the flu for a week, running a fever that left me weak and dizzy. Maria had been checking on me, bringing soup and making sure I took my medicine, but she had her own family to care for, her own job demanding her attention. I called David, hoping to hear a familiar voice, maybe even hoping he would offer to come check on me. The phone rang 5 times before he answered, and when he did, his voice was distracted, impatient. Hi, Mommy, I can't really talk right now. I'm at a fundraising dinner for families in Gaza. Can I call you back tomorrow? I've been sick, I said, hating how small my voice sounded. The flu. Maria's been taking care of me, but I just wanted to hear your voice. Oh, that's too bad. Make sure you drink plenty of fluids and get some rest. Listen, I really have to go. There are some important people here I need to talk to. I'll call you this weekend, okay? But he didn't call that weekend. Or the next one. That's when I started paying attention to the things I had been trying not to see. The way David only called when he needed something. Money for a security deposit when he moved to a better apartment. Emotional support when his work became overwhelming. Understanding when he missed yet another family gathering for a conference or protest or meeting that was always more important than whatever we had planned. I started adding up the money I had given him over the years. The rent payments, the grocery money, the student loan help, the travel expenses for his cause-related trips. It wasn't just the money that hurt, though that was substantial enough to make my head spin. It was the realization that I had become nothing more than a resource to be tapped when needed, a source of unconditional support that he took for granted because it had always been there. He's using you, Miguel said one night as we watched a movie on the television, some old film from the 70s where families actually talked to each other. He's taking advantage of your love. Don't say that, I snapped, but the words hit something deep and tender, a wound I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. When was the last time he asked about my health? Miguel continued, his voice sad rather than angry. When was the last time he remembered that I exist? I couldn't answer because I couldn't remember. That's when I started noticing other things. Like how David's social media posts, which Maria sometimes showed me on her phone, were filled with photos of him at galas and conferences, always well-dressed, always surrounded by other young professionals who looked like they had never worried about paying rent or choosing between groceries and medicine. His Instagram feed was a catalog of international travel, fancy restaurants, and cause-related events that clearly cost more money than the non-profit salary he claimed to be struggling with. Where is he getting the money for all this? I asked Maria one afternoon as she scrolled through photos of David at some black tie event in Washington, D.C. Maria looked uncomfortable. Maybe the organization pays for travel? Or maybe Layla helps out. She comes from a wealthy family, I think. The realization hit me like a physical blow. While I had been scrimping and saving to help my son manage his student loans and living expenses, he had been using that financial security as a foundation to build a completely different life. A life with people who shared his passions and his politics, people who could afford to care about global issues because they had never had to worry about local survival. I was subsidizing his ability to ignore me. That Tuesday evening in October, when I overheard his phone conversation in Arabic, was the moment I finally understood how far he had traveled from the family that had made his journey possible. He was speaking with the kind of intimate urgency I remembered from his childhood, when he would whisper secrets with his best friends, their heads bent together over comic books or baseball cards. But these weren't childhood secrets. This was the voice of a man sharing his deepest commitments with people who understood him in ways his own mother never could. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen for nearly 2 hours, staring at the two-play settings I had arranged out of foolish hope. The silence in my apartment felt different that night, heavier somehow, like the weight of all the conversations we should have had but never did, all the questions I should have asked but was too afraid to voice. I thought about the college brochures spread across the same table 18 years ago, about the young man who had looked at me with such love and determination and promised that his education would be a gift we would all share. Somewhere along the way, that gift had become a wall between us, built from good intentions and paved with my own sacrifices. I got up from the table and walked to my bedroom, where I keep the important papers in an old shoebox on the top shelf of my closet. Bank statements showing the money transferred to David over the years. Medical bills I had paid when he didn't have insurance. Credit card statements for the plane tickets I had bought him when he needed to get somewhere for his work but couldn't afford the fare. The numbers were staggering. Over the past 8 years, I had given David more than $40,000. Money I had earned scrubbing floors and cleaning toilets, money I had saved by buying generic groceries and wearing clothes until they fell apart, money I had intended to be my security in old age. I had bought his freedom to care about everyone except me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood by my bedroom window looking down at Northern Boulevard, watching the late-night buses carry home the people who worked while the rest of the city slept. Nurses finishing overnight shifts, security guards heading home to grab a few hours of rest before their next job, cleaning crews like I used to be, invisible people who kept the world running while everyone else dreamed. I thought about my own dreams, the ones I had put aside to make David's dreams possible. I had wanted to go back to school once, maybe study to become a medical technician instead of just cleaning the medical offices. I had wanted to travel, to see something of the world beyond Queens and Manhattan. I had wanted to have money saved for emergencies, for the inevitable health problems that come with age, for the dignity of not being a burden to my children. Instead, I had an empty bank account and a son who called me only when he needed something. The next morning, I did something I had never done before. I called David, not to check on him or offer support, but to ask for something myself. "Hi, Mommy," he said, and I could hear street noise in the background. "What's up?" "I need to ask you something," I said, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it through the phone. "I want you to start paying me back." There was a long pause. "Paying you back for what?" "The money I've given you over the years. The rent payments, the student loan help, all of it. I need you to start paying me back." Another pause, longer this time. "Mommy, I thought that was?" "I mean, you offered to help. You said it was what family does for each other." "It is what family does," I said. "And now I need my family to do something for me. But you know I can't afford to pay you back right now. My work doesn't pay very much, and with Layla's student loans and the rent in Brooklyn." "Layla's student loans?" I interrupted. "You're helping pay her student loans?" "Well, we're planning to get married, so we're sharing expenses. It's what couples do." The casual way he said it, the assumption that of course he would help the woman he loved with her financial burdens while dismissing his obligation to the woman who had made his love possible, hit me like a slap. "When were you planning to tell me you're getting married?" I asked. "We're not officially engaged yet. We're waiting for the right time. There's so much going on with her work right now, and we want to have a ceremony that reflects both of our backgrounds and commitments." He talked for another 10 minutes about wedding plans that included everyone except his family, about a future that had no room for the people who had made his present possible. I listened to my son describe a life that sounded like it was happening to someone else, someone who had no history, no obligations, no mother sitting alone in a queen's apartment counting the cost of love that was never returned. When he finally stopped talking, I said quietly, "I need the money back, David. I'm 73 years old, and I need financial security. I need to know that the sacrifices I made meant something more than just giving you the freedom to forget where you came from." "Mommy, that's not fair. I haven't forgotten anything. I'm just trying to build a life that has meaning, that contributes something to the world." "And what about contributing something to the woman who made your life possible?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll see what I can do. But right now isn't a good time. Maybe after Layla finishes her big case, or after we get through this fundraising push for the organization." "It's never a good time, is it?" I said. "There's always something more important than the family who supported you." "Mommy, please don't make this about choosing sides. You know I love you. You know I'm grateful for everything you've done. But I have responsibilities now, commitments that are bigger than just our family. Bigger than the woman who raised you. Bigger than the people who sacrificed everything so you could have the luxury of caring about strangers." "They're not strangers," he said, and for the first time in our conversation, his voice carried real emotion. "They're people whose homes have been stolen, whose children are growing up without hope. How can you ask me to turn my back on that?" "I'm not asking you to turn your back on anyone. I'm asking you to remember that you have a mother who is growing old alone while you save the world." We hung up angry, both of us hurt and neither of us willing to bend. But something fundamental had shifted in that conversation. For the first time in 8 years, I had asked David for something instead of just giving. And his response told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in his list of priorities. That afternoon, I called my bank and opened a separate savings account. A small fortress of independence that David wouldn't even know existed. I started calculating how much money I could save if I stopped subsidizing his moral crusade. The number was shocking enough to make me dizzy with possibility. For the next 3 weeks, David didn't call. Usually, his silence would have sent me into a spiral of worry and guilt. I would have called him, apologized for being selfish, offered to forget about the money if he would just talk to me again. But this time, I let the silence stretch between us like a bridge I was no longer willing to cross. Maria noticed the change immediately. "You seem different, Mama," she said during one of her weekend visits. "Calmer somehow. Less worried." "I'm tired of worrying," I told her. "I'm tired of loving people more than they love me back." She looked at me with something that might have been pride. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to stop giving David money," I said. "And I'm going to stop pretending that his neglect is acceptable because his cause is noble. And if he gets angry? Then he gets angry. I've spent 8 years managing his emotions and subsidizing his choices. It's time for him to manage his own life." That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I bought myself new sheets, soft blue ones that felt like comfort against my skin. I bought flowers for my kitchen table, bright yellow daffodils that looked like small suns. I made dinner for one and enjoyed every bite without wondering if I should have cooked enough for a son who wouldn't come home anyway. It was a small liberation. But it felt like the beginning of something larger. The call came on a Sunday evening 3 weeks later. David's voice was tight with stress and something that sounded like desperation. "Mommy, I need to ask you a favor," he said without preamble. "Layla's organization is sending her to Geneva for a human rights conference, but they can only cover part of the travel expenses. We need to come up with $1,500 by Friday, and we've already maxed out our credit cards." I felt the familiar pull, the mother's instinct to solve my child's problems, to smooth his path and make his worries disappear. For 26 years, that instinct had governed every decision I made about David. But this time, I recognized it as the trap it had always been. "No," I said simply. "No? I won't give you any more money, David. You're a grown man with a career and a fiancé. Figure it out yourselves." "Mommy, this is important. This conference could change Layla's whole career. She has a chance to present her research on displacement and refugee rights to people who could actually make policy changes. Then she should find a way to pay for it herself. Or maybe your organization should prioritize their employees' professional development. Or maybe you should ask your wealthy girlfriend's family for help, since you're already helping them with their financial obligations. That's not how it works, he said, and I could hear the edge of anger creeping into his voice. Layla's family has their own struggles. Her father's been out of work for months because of discrimination in his field. And the organization is doing important work, but they're always operating on a shoestring budget. And I'm operating on a janitor's retirement fund, I said. But somehow I'm always the one expected to solve everyone else's money problems. You're my mother, he said, as if that explained everything. When I succeed, you succeed. When I make a difference in the world, it reflects on how you raised me. Does it? Because when you ignore me for months at a time, what does that reflect about how I raised you? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Are you seriously going to punish me for trying to make the world a better place? I'm not punishing you for anything. I'm refusing to subsidize a life that has no room for me in it. That's not true. You know I love you. Do I? When was the last time you called just to talk to me? When was the last time you asked about my health, my worries, my happiness? When was the last time you treated me like a person instead of an ATM? That's not fair, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. What's not fair is a son who takes his mother's sacrifices for granted while lavishing attention on everyone except the woman who made his compassion possible. We hung up again, this time with more hurt than anger between us. But I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the strange lightness that comes from setting down a burden you didn't realize you were carrying. Over the next month, David tried various approaches to change my mind. He called Miguel, hoping his father would convince me to be reasonable. He enlisted Maria to advocate for him, painting me as heartless and selfish for refusing to help with important causes. He even tried calling me directly a few times, alternating between guilt and manipulation, reminding me of all the sacrifices he was making for social justice, implying that my refusal to support him was somehow a betrayal of my own values. But something had shifted in me permanently. Each conversation only reinforced my growing understanding that David had never seen me as a complete person with my own needs and dreams and limitations. I was a resource in his life, valuable for what I could provide but not particularly interesting as a human being in my own right. The realization was painful but also liberating. I started making different choices. I signed up for a pottery class at the senior center in Astoria, something I had always wanted to try but never had time for when I was working multiple jobs to support David's education and career. My hands, so familiar with mops and cleaning solutions, discovered a different kind of satisfaction in shaping clay on a potter's wheel. The instructor, a gentle woman named Patricia who had been a high school art teacher before retiring, praised my natural feel for the medium. You have strong hands, she told me during my third session. Hands that know how to create something beautiful from raw materials. For the first time in years, I felt seen for something other than my willingness to sacrifice. I reconnected with Ruth from downstairs, whose friendship I had neglected during the years when I was too exhausted from work and worry about David to maintain relationships with people my own age. Ruth introduced me to her friend Carmen, who volunteered at the local food pantry, and Carmen introduced me to a whole network of women who had discovered that life after 70 could be a time of growth rather than just maintenance. We met for coffee at the small Dominican cafe on Roosevelt Avenue, sharing stories about ungrateful children and demanding husbands and the peculiar freedom that comes with finally putting yourself first. These women understood things about sacrifice and disappointment that David, for all his education and global awareness, couldn't begin to comprehend. My daughter moved to California 15 years ago, Carmen told us one afternoon as we sat around a small table covered with the remains of Tres Leches cake and strong Cuban coffee. She calls twice a year, on Mother's Day and my birthday, and spends the whole conversation talking about her problems. Her marriage, her job, her children's school issues. She never asks about my life because she can't imagine I have one that doesn't revolve around being her mother. But do you still send her money? Ruth asked gently. Carmen laughed, a sound both bitter and amused. I used to. Every crisis, every emergency, every time she needed something. Until I realized that the emergencies only happened when she was out of ways to solve her own problems. Then she would remember she had a mother. What changed? I asked. I got cancer 3 years ago, Carmen said matter-of-factly. Nothing dramatic, caught early, good prognosis. But going through chemotherapy alone, because my daughter was too busy with her important life to come take care of me, made me understand that I had trained her to see me as a resource rather than a person. So I stopped being a resource. Was she angry? Furious. Called me selfish, cruel, said I didn't understand how hard her life was. But you know what? After about 6 months, she started calling more often. Not for money, just to talk. It took a health crisis and a financial boundary to teach my 50-year-old daughter that her mother exists as something other than a solution to her problems. These conversations gave me language for feelings I had been struggling to articulate. They also gave me models for how to love adult children without enabling their selfishness, how to maintain relationships without accepting disrespect, how to be generous without being taken advantage of. They also helped me understand that David's behavior wasn't unique or personal. It was part of a pattern that many families fall into, where one person's needs and sacrifices become invisible while everyone else's dreams and crises take center stage. Breaking that pattern required something I had never been good at, saying no and meaning it. The test came sooner than I expected. It was late November, just before Thanksgiving, when David called with a new crisis. Layla had been offered a position with a major human rights organization based in Geneva, a dream job that would establish her as a major voice in international law. But she needed to be in Switzerland by January, and they needed money for visa fees, relocation expenses, and the deposit on an apartment in one of the most expensive cities in the world. "This is the opportunity of a lifetime, Mommy," David said, his voice vibrating with excitement and urgency. "Layla will be working directly with UN officials on refugee policy. She'll be in a position to actually influence international law, to help create protections for displaced people around the world." "That sounds wonderful," I said carefully. "I'm happy for her. The thing is, we need to come up with $8,000 in the next 3 weeks. Her family is helping as much as they can, but they're still recovering from her father's period of unemployment. And my organization can't give me an advance because their funding cycle doesn't reset until the new fiscal year." Here it was. The moment I had been preparing for without realizing it. $8,000 was more money than I had in my savings account. It was more than I spent on myself in an entire year. It was the kind of money that represented security and dignity in old age, the difference between independence and becoming a burden to my children. "I can't help you," I said. "What do you mean you can't help? You have money saved." "I know you do. I have money saved for my own old age, for medical emergencies, for the dignity of not having to depend on children who might be too busy saving the world to take care of their mother." "Mommy, this is different. This isn't just about us. This is about Layla having the chance to help thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands. How can you put your personal financial security above that kind of impact?" "Because thousands of people didn't raise you," I said. "Because hundreds of thousands of refugees didn't work double shifts to pay for your education. Because the woman who sacrificed everything to give you the luxury of caring about global justice deserves some consideration too." "You're being selfish," he said, and his voice carried a coldness I had never heard before. "You're putting your own comfort above the chance to help people who are literally dying for lack of international protection." "And you're being manipulative," I replied, surprising both of us with the steel in my voice. "You're trying to make me feel guilty for having boundaries, for refusing to impoverish myself to fund someone else's career ambitions." "Someone else? Layla is going to be my wife. Her success is my success, our success as a family." "But I'm not part of that family, am I? When was the last time you included me in your plans, asked my opinion about your decisions, treated me like someone whose feelings matter?" There was a long silence. Then David said, "If you don't help us with this, I don't know when I'll be able to pay you back any of the money you say I owe you. This job for Layla could change everything for us financially." The threat was implicit but clear. "Help us now, or lose any hope of recovering the $40,000 you've already invested in my dreams. Then I guess I'll have to write that money off as the cost of learning who my son really is," I said. "You're making a huge mistake," David said. "You're going to regret this for the rest of your life. When Layla is accepting awards for her human rights work, when we're making a real difference in the world, you'll remember that you could have been part of something important but chose to be petty instead. And when you're living in Geneva with your important wife doing your important work," I said, "I hope you'll remember the woman who made all of your opportunities possible. The woman you only called when you needed something. The woman you threw away for not being useful enough." I hung up the phone and immediately started crying. Not the quiet tears of sadness I was used to, but the deep, wrenching sobs of grief. I was mourning the death of the relationship I had thought I had with my son, the illusion that his love was as deep and unconditional as mine had always been. But underneath the grief was something else, relief. The relief of finally speaking the truth, of finally refusing to participate in my own diminishment, of finally choosing dignity over the desperate hope that more sacrifice would somehow earn me the love and respect I had never received. The next morning, I called Maria. I cut David off financially, I told her without preamble. And I think he's going to cut me off emotionally in return. Maria was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "How do you feel about that?" Heartbroken, I said honestly. But also free. I'm proud of you, Mama, she said. It's about time somebody in this family stood up to David's selfishness. You think I did the right thing? I think you finally did the healthy thing. David has spent years taking advantage of your generosity and your guilt. Maybe losing access to your money will teach him to value you for more than what you can provide. But I wasn't sure David was capable of that kind of learning. The weeks leading up to Christmas were strange and painful. For the first time in 8 years, I didn't send David money for holiday travel. I didn't offer to pay for gifts for Layla or contribute to whatever cause was consuming his attention. I bought presents for Maria's children and for Miguel, and I bought myself something I had wanted for years, a warm winter coat made of real wool, something beautiful enough to make me feel elegant when I wore it. David didn't call on Christmas morning. Maria told me later that he had posted photos on social media from some holiday party with Layla's family, images of him smiling and laughing with people who looked like they had never worried about money or wondered if their children appreciated them. The absence of his call hurt, but it also confirmed what I had suspected. When I stopped being useful, I stopped being important. January came and went without any word from David. Through Maria, I learned that Layla had gotten the job in Geneva and that they were planning to move there together, unmarried but committed to building a life around their shared passion for international human rights work. He had apparently found other sources of funding for their relocation, probably Layla's family or some combination of credit cards and loans that would keep them financially stressed but politically pure. I tried not to think about whether he missed me. I tried to focus on the new rhythms of my own life, the pottery classes and coffee dates and volunteer work at the food pantry that filled my days with purpose that had nothing to do with managing other people's crises. But late at night, staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. What kind of mother chooses her own financial security over her son's dreams? What kind of woman puts personal boundaries above the chance to help support work that might genuinely improve the world? Those doubts followed me through the winter months like shadows. Even the women at the senior center, who had supported my decision to stop enabling David, sometimes looked at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Were they proud of me for standing up for myself, or did they think I was a bitter old woman who had driven away her own child? The answer came in March, in the form of a phone call that changed everything I thought I understood about the situation. I was kneading clay at the pottery studio, working on a set of bowls that I planned to give Maria for her birthday, when my cell phone buzzed with an international number. For a moment, my heart leaped with the hope that David was calling to apologize, to tell me he missed me, to ask if we could find a way to repair what had been broken between us. Instead, it was Layla. Mrs. Rodriguez? Her voice was professional but strained, the voice of someone making a difficult phone call. This is Layla. I'm not sure if David has mentioned me, but I'm his. We're together. I know who you are, I said carefully. I'm calling because I think there are some things you should know about David's relationship with money. And with you. For the next 20 minutes, Layla told me things that reconfigured everything I thought I knew about my son's financial situation and his attitude toward his family. David, it turned out, had been lying to both of us. While he told me that he was struggling financially and needed my help to survive, he had been telling Layla that his family, particularly his mother, was wealthy and had been supporting his activist work out of shared commitment to social justice. He had borrowed thousands of dollars from Layla's family under the pretense that his mother would eventually reimburse them, money that he used to fund the lifestyle of someone more financially secure than his non-profit salary should have allowed. He's been living in a studio apartment in Park Slope that costs $3,000 a month, Layla told me. He told me you were helping him with the rent because you believed in his work. When you stopped sending money and he couldn't make the payments, he convinced me to lend him the money from my savings. He said it was temporary, just until he could arrange for another transfer from his family. My hands were shaking as I listened to her describe the web of lies David had constructed to maintain his image as both a struggling activist and a devoted son supported by loving parents. But that's not even the worst part, Layla continued. Last month, I overheard him on the phone with someone from his organization. He was complaining about how difficult it was to manage what he called family obligations. He said his mother was emotionally manipulative and used money to try to control his choices. He said the hardest part of moving to Geneva would be getting far enough away that his family couldn't guilt him into supporting them financially. The irony was so painful it was almost funny. While I had been agonizing over whether I was being selfish for refusing to support David's dreams, he had been presenting himself as the victim of my financial manipulation. While I had been worried that I was failing him as a mother, he had been positioning our relationship as a burden he was eager to escape. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because I think you deserve to know the truth. And because She paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. Because I'm starting to see a pattern in how David relates to people who care about him. Everything is transactional. Everything is about what other people can do to support his vision of himself and his work. I don't think he's capable of love that doesn't serve his own interests. Are you breaking up with him? I already did. That's why I'm calling. I wanted you to know that the money question, the thing that came between you and David, was never really about money. It was about his inability to see you as a person rather than a resource. And I wanted you to know that choosing yourself over his demands wasn't selfish. It was the healthiest thing you could have done. After I hung up the phone, I sat in the pottery studio for another hour, ostensibly working on my bowls but really trying to process what I had learned. The relief was enormous but complicated. I had been right to protect myself, right to refuse David's financial demands, right to insist on being treated with dignity and respect. But the confirmation that my son was capable of such calculated deception was almost too painful to bear. That night, I called Maria and told her everything Layla had revealed. I can't say I'm surprised, Maria said quietly. David has always been good at presenting different versions of himself to different people. But I'm sorry, Mama. I'm sorry he hurt you like this. I'm not sorry anymore, I realized as I said it. I'm free. Freedom, it turned out, was not the absence of pain but the presence of choice. For the first time in 8 years, I had full control over my time, my money, and my emotional energy. The realization was intoxicating. I signed up for a conversational Spanish class, something I had always wanted to do but never had time for. My Spanish had gotten rusty over the years, worn down by decades of speaking mostly English at work and at home. Rediscovering my first language felt like reclaiming a part of myself I had almost forgot existed. I started traveling, small trips at first. A weekend in Washington, D.C. to visit the museums I had always wanted to see. A week in Florida to visit Miguel's sister, who I hadn't seen in 15 years because there had never been money for non-essential travel. Each trip was a revelation, a reminder that the world was larger and more interesting than the small radius of obligation I had been living within. Most importantly, I started seeing myself differently. Not as someone whose value depended on being useful to others, but as someone with her own interests, her own opinions, her own right to happiness and respect. The pottery studio became a place of meditation and creation. Patricia, the instructor, became a real friend. We would stay after class to work on personal projects, talking about art and politics and the strange liberation of discovering new forms of creativity in the 7th decade of life. Your work has so much emotion in it, Patricia told me one afternoon as I pulled a finished vase from the kiln. You can see the story in every piece. She was right. The bowls and vases and small sculptures I was creating carried the weight of 40 years of suppressed creativity, of nights I had been too tired to imagine beauty, of hands that had only known work and service learning to shape something purely for the joy of shaping it. Summer arrived with its oppressive humidity and the sounds of children playing in the fire hydrant spray on Northern Boulevard. I bought an air conditioner for my bedroom, a small luxury I had denied myself for years in favor of sending that money to David. The cool air felt like a blessing, like the physical manifestation of being able to prioritize my own comfort. It was on a particularly hot evening in July when David called. I didn't recognize the number at first, another international connection crackling with distance and poor reception. When I heard his voice, my first instinct was to hang up. But something in his tone, a defeat I had never heard before, made me stay on the line. Mommy, he said, and the old endearment sounded strange after months of silence. I wanted to call and I wanted to talk to you. I'm listening, I said carefully. Layla left me. The words came out in a rush, like he had been holding them back. She took the job in Geneva, but she broke up with me. She said I didn't know how to love people, only how to use them. I waited for him to continue, refusing to fill the silence with comfort I wasn't sure he deserved. She told me she called you. She told me what she said about the money and the lies. His voice was small, younger than I had heard it sound in years. I wanted to explain. Explain what? How you lied to me for 8 years. How you told your girlfriend that I was manipulative and controlling. How you presented me as the villain in your life story while taking $40,000 of my retirement money. It wasn't like that, he said weakly. I mean, it was, but it wasn't. I didn't mean for it to be like that. What did you mean for it to be like? There was a long pause. I don't know, he said finally. I think I just wanted everyone to see me as independent, as someone who was making it on his own merit. But I also needed help, and I didn't know how to ask for it without feeling like I was failing. So you lied instead. So I lied instead. The admission sounded like it cost him something. To you, to Layla, to myself. I created this whole narrative where I was this noble person sacrificing for important causes, but the truth is I was just scared. Scared of not being good enough, scared of not being able to take care of myself, scared of being ordinary. For the first time in our conversation, he sounded like the son I remembered, the boy who used to confess his fears to me in the darkness of his bedroom, who trusted me to love him even when he wasn't perfect. "And what about now?" I asked. "Are you still scared?" "Terrified," he said. "I'm 30 years old, and I don't know how to have a relationship that isn't based on what I can get from other people. I don't know how to love someone without resenting them for not meeting all my needs. I don't know how to be grateful without feeling trapped. What do you want from me, David?" "I want to start over." The words came out quietly, tentatively. "I want to learn how to be your son instead of just someone who takes things from you. I want to pay you back, all of it, even if it takes me 10 years. I want to call you because I miss you, not because I need something. I want to be the person you raised me to be instead of the person I became." I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of the anger and hurt I had been carrying for months. Not forgiveness, exactly, but the possibility of it. "That would require you to see me as a person," I said. "Not just as your mother, but as someone with my own life, my own interests, my own limitations. It would require you to be interested in who I am now, not just grateful for what I've given you." "Tell me," he said. "Tell me who you are now." So I did. I told him about the pottery classes, about my new friends, about the Spanish conversation group and the weekend trips and the volunteer work that filled my days with purpose that had nothing to do with managing other people's crises. I told him about the air conditioner and the wool coat and the small choices I made every day to prioritize my own comfort and happiness. I told him about the relief of having money in the bank that was mine, that I didn't have to worry about being asked to share or sacrifice or justify. I told him about the freedom of going to sleep at night without wondering if he was okay, if he needed anything, if I was failing him by not offering help he hadn't asked for. I told him about the pottery studio and how it felt to create something beautiful with no purpose except beauty, no audience except myself. "You sound happy," he said, and there was surprise in his voice. "I am happy. For the first time in years, I'm happy." "And you're happy without me in your life?" "I'm happy with myself in my life," I corrected. "Whether you're part of that life depends on whether you can learn to be in relationship with someone without trying to control or consume them." We talked for 2 more hours, the longest conversation we had had in years. For the first time, David asked questions about my life that weren't related to his needs or problems. He asked about Patricia and the pottery studio, about my friendship with Carmen and Ruth, about whether I was dating anyone or thinking about dating anyone. "Are you?" he asked. "Dating, I mean. There's a man in my Spanish conversation class," I said, surprising myself by admitting it out loud. "His name is Roberto. He's a retired teacher, a widower. We've had coffee a few times." "That's wonderful, Mommy. You deserve to have someone who appreciates you." The conversation was far from perfect. David still seemed to think that acknowledgement of his mistakes was the same thing as actually changing his behavior. He still talked about his work with the kind of self-important intensity that had always annoyed Miguel. But for the first time, he seemed genuinely curious about my life as something separate from his own needs and dramas. When we hung up, I didn't feel the old mixture of hope and dread that usually followed conversations with David. I felt cautiously optimistic but not dependent on his follow-through. If he meant what he said about wanting to rebuild our relationship, he would demonstrate that through actions, not just words. And if he didn't, I would be fine. Better than fine. I would be free to continue building a life that belonged entirely to me. Over the following months, David called regularly. Not with crises or requests for money, but with updates about his new job teaching English in Berlin, his therapy sessions, his tentative attempts to build relationships based on reciprocity rather than extraction. He sent small amounts of money when he could, $20 or $50 at a time, a symbolic acknowledgement of his debt rather than any meaningful repayment. More importantly, he started asking questions and listening to the answers. He wanted to know about my pottery projects, about Roberto and whether I was serious about him, about how I was handling Miguel's increasing health problems and whether I needed any support that he could actually provide. The changes were small but significant. When I mentioned that I was nervous about a minor outpatient procedure, David called the night before to wish me luck and then called again the next day to check on my recovery. When I told him I was considering adopting a cat, he spent 20 minutes helping me think through the practical considerations instead of lecturing me about the global overpopulation of domestic animals. "You're different," I told him during one of our conversations. "More present somehow." "I'm trying to learn how to be in relationships instead of just using them," he said. "It's harder than I thought it would be." I keep catching myself trying to manage other people's emotions or expecting them to manage mine. What changed? Losing everyone I cared about, he said simply. Losing Layla, losing you, realizing that I had pushed away anyone who actually loved me in favor of people who just admired my work or found me useful. I didn't want to spend my life surrounded by people who only valued me for what I could do for them, but that's all I knew how to be for other people. And now? Now I'm trying to learn how to love people without needing them to be anything other than who they are. How to be grateful without feeling trapped. How to receive support without resenting the person providing it. How's that going? Some days better than others. But I think I'm finally becoming someone I actually like, instead of just someone I thought other people should admire. It was progress, slow and imperfect but real. David was still living in Europe, still working in human rights, still passionate about causes that seemed abstract to me. But he had started to understand that his passion for saving the world didn't excuse him from the basic obligations of loving the people who had made his passion possible. Meanwhile, my own life continued to expand in directions I could never have imagined when I was working 3 jobs to support David's education. Roberto and I started spending more time together, cautious but growing closer, 2 people who had survived difficult marriages and complicated children and were discovering the particular sweetness of companionship that asks for nothing more than mutual enjoyment. "You're blooming," Patricia told me one afternoon as we worked side by side in the pottery studio. "You look like someone who just discovered she's allowed to want things for herself." She was right. At 74, I was learning desires I hadn't allowed myself to have for decades. I wanted to travel to Mexico and see the places my grandmother had described in the stories she told when I was small. I wanted to take a cooking class and learn to make something more adventurous than the rice and beans that had sustained my family for 30 years. I wanted to buy art for my apartment, real art made by local artists, instead of just the photographs and religious pictures that had decorated my walls for decades. Most of all, I wanted to continue discovering who I was when I wasn't defined entirely by my relationships with other people, when I wasn't sacrificing every opportunity for growth in favor of managing other people's crises. The final test of David's transformation came in December, almost 2 years after our relationship had imploded over Layla's job opportunity. Miguel's health had been declining gradually, the accumulated damage from decades of physical labor finally catching up with him. He needed surgery to repair a hernia that had become dangerously complicated, and the recovery would require several weeks of careful monitoring and assistance. I called David to let him know about the surgery, not because I expected him to come home but because he had asked to be kept informed about family developments. "I'll be there," he said immediately. "When is the surgery scheduled?" "Next Tuesday." "But David, you don't need to come. Maria and I can handle it, and I know you're busy with work." "I'm coming," he said firmly. "Miguel helped raise me, and you shouldn't have to manage his recovery alone. I'll arrange to work remotely for a few weeks." He arrived 3 days before the surgery, thinner than I remembered and wearing clothes that looked like they had come from a thrift store rather than the expensive boutiques he used to favor. But he looked more solid somehow, more present in his own skin. The first awkward moment came when he walked into our apartment and saw how much I had changed it. The new furniture, the art on the walls, the general sense of a space that had been arranged for comfort rather than just practicality. "This looks amazing, Mommy," he said, and he sounded genuinely pleased rather than threatened by evidence of my independent life. "You've made it so beautiful." He met Roberto without drama, treating him with the kind of respectful friendliness he might have extended to any of my friends rather than the suspicious interrogation I had feared. He complimented my pottery, asked intelligent questions about my volunteer work, and listened to my stories about the senior center without offering advice or judgment. Most importantly, he threw himself into Miguel's care with the kind of attention and patience I hadn't seen from him since he was a teenager. He drove Miguel to medical appointments, helped him shower when his mobility was limited, and sat with him during the long afternoons of recovery when pain medication made conversation difficult but companionship was still comforting. "Your son is a good man," Miguel told me one evening as David helped him settle into his favorite chair with pillows positioned to support his surgical incisions. "I was worried about him for a while, but he's figured out what matters." "What matters?" "Family. Not the idea of family, but the actual people who love you enough to show up when things are hard." During the weeks David was home, I watched him carefully for signs of the old patterns, the resentment and manipulation that had characterized our relationship for so many years. But they didn't appear. Instead, I saw a man who had learned to be present without needing to be the center of attention, who could provide support without keeping score, who could accept gratitude without treating it as payment for love. He still talked about his work, but differently now. Instead of presenting himself as a crusader saving the world, he described it as a job he found meaningful, one contribution to problems that were too large for any individual to solve. He had developed humility, and it made him easier to be around. "I'm proud of you," I told him one night as we sat in my kitchen after Miguel had gone to sleep. "Not just for the work you're doing, but for the person you've become." "I had a good teacher," he said. "It just took me a long time to learn the lessons." "What lessons?" "That love isn't something you earn through achievement or lose through failure. That taking care of people isn't the same thing as controlling them. That being grateful doesn't make you weak, and having needs doesn't make you burdensome." He paused, looking around the kitchen where he had sat as a child doing homework while I cooked dinner after my hospital shifts. "And that the person who sacrificed the most for my happiness deserved better than being treated like an obligation I was trying to escape." We both cried a little, the kind of tears that come with relief rather than sadness, the recognition that something broken had been repaired not through dramatic gestures but through the slow, careful work of building new patterns of relationship. When David returned to Berlin after Miguel's recovery, our phone calls continued but with a different quality. We talked about my pottery projects and his teaching, about Roberto's courtship and his own tentative steps toward dating someone new, about books we were reading and places we wanted to travel. He still sent small amounts of money when he could, still expressed his intention to eventually repay me fully, though we both understood that the financial debt was less important than the emotional growth that had made repayment possible. More significantly, he started including me in his life in ways that didn't require anything from me except interest and affection. He sent photos of his small apartment in Berlin, of the school where he taught, of weekend trips with friends who seemed to genuinely enjoy his company rather than just his usefulness. He asked for advice about workplace conflicts and relationship decisions, treating my opinions as valuable rather than obstacles to his independence. Most importantly, he started visiting regularly, not because of emergencies or obligations but because he missed us and wanted to be part of our lives. He came home for Maria's birthday, for Miguel's 75th, for the holidays not as someone fulfilling duty but as someone choosing connection. "He's so much happier now," Maria observed during one of these visits. "And so much easier to love." She was right. The David who sat at our kitchen table now, helping Miguel with a crossword puzzle while I finished preparing dinner, bore little resemblance to the angry, entitled young man who had once dismissed our concerns as attempts to control his life. He had learned to receive love without resenting it, to express gratitude without feeling diminished by it, to be present with people without needing them to affirm his importance. But the most profound change isn't in David. It's in me. At 75, I have discovered what it means to love people without sacrificing myself for them, to be generous without being exploited, to maintain relationships without accepting disrespect. I have learned that saying no to unreasonable demands doesn't make me selfish, it makes me someone worth respecting. My days are full of activities I chose for my own pleasure and growth. I take pottery classes and Spanish lessons, volunteer at the food pantry and the senior center, have coffee dates with friends and evening walks with Roberto. I travel when I want to, buy things I need without guilt, and make decisions based on what will make me happy rather than what will prevent other people from being disappointed in me. The apartment that once felt like a shrine to other people's achievements has become a reflection of my own interests and tastes. The walls are covered with art I chose, pottery I made, photographs from trips I took for my own pleasure. The furniture is arranged for my comfort, the colors chosen to please my eye, the books on my shelf selected because they interested me rather than because they might impress visitors. Most days, I don't think about the money I gave David over the years or the time I spent worrying about problems that weren't mine to solve. When I do think about those years, it's with sadness for the woman I was then, someone so afraid of being unloved that she accepted being disrespected, someone so focused on earning affection that she forgot she deserved it simply for existing. But I also feel grateful for the journey that brought me here. The pain of David's rejection forced me to discover sources of joy and purpose that had nothing to do with managing other people's lives. The anger I felt about being taken advantage of taught me to value myself enough to set boundaries. The loneliness of being emotionally abandoned by someone I had sacrificed everything for led me to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving. I think about the woman I was at 70, exhausted and resentful, working multiple jobs to subsidize the dreams of a son who barely acknowledged my existence. I think about the nights I spent lying awake wondering what I had done wrong, why my love wasn't enough to earn the basic respect of being seen as a complete person rather than just a resource to be tapped when needed. That woman couldn't have imagined the life I have now. She couldn't have pictured herself signing up for art classes or planning trips or having the confidence to end conversations with people who treated her poorly. She couldn't have envisioned a world where her happiness mattered as much as everyone else's, where her needs were as valid as the needs of people she loved. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It required months of practice in choosing myself, in saying no without explaining or apologizing, in believing that my comfort and dignity were worth protecting. It required learning to tolerate other people's disappointment when I refused to sacrifice my own well-being for their convenience. But it was possible. At an age when most people assume their fundamental patterns are set in stone, I discovered that I could still grow, still change, still become someone I genuinely liked and respected. Last month, David sent me a photo from his new apartment in Berlin. He's dating a German teacher named Anna who seems to appreciate him for who he is rather than what he can do for her. They're talking about marriage, about building a life together based on partnership rather than the kind of dramatic intensity that characterized his relationship with Layla. She makes me want to be a better person, he wrote in the email that accompanied the photo. Not because she demands it or manipulates me into it, but because being around someone who loves herself makes me want to love myself too. I understand what he means. Love that comes from a place of self-respect creates space for other people to grow into their best selves. Love that comes from desperation or fear creates only obligation and resentment. Roberto and I are talking about moving in together, combining our resources and our lives in a partnership built on mutual enjoyment rather than need. We're both old enough to know what we want and confident enough to ask for it. We're both financially independent and emotionally stable, looking for companionship rather than rescue. I love how happy you are, he told me last week as we worked together in my kitchen, preparing dinner for friends who were coming to see my latest pottery exhibition. You laugh like someone who genuinely enjoys her own life. I do enjoy my own life. For the first time in decades, I wake up in the morning curious about what the day will bring rather than anxious about calls I might receive or problems I might be expected to solve. I make plans based on what interests me rather than what others need from me. I spend money on things that bring me pleasure without calculating whether that money might be needed for someone else's crisis. I have learned that it's possible to love people deeply without making their happiness your responsibility. It's possible to be generous without being exploited, supportive without being used, caring without being consumed. The pottery studio has become my sanctuary, the place where I go to create something beautiful for no reason except the joy of creating it. My hands, which spent 40 years cleaning other people's messes and managing other people's needs, have discovered the particular satisfaction of shaping clay into forms that exist only to please the eye and touch of whoever encounters them. Patricia recently suggested that I apply for a show at the local gallery, a group exhibition featuring work by artists over 70. The idea terrifies and thrills me in equal measure. At my age, developing a new identity as an artist feels both audacious and natural, the logical extension of finally claiming space for my own growth and expression. Why not? I told her. I've spent enough years hiding my light under other people's bushes. Maybe it's time to let it shine. Yesterday was my 75th birthday. David called from Berlin to wish me happy birthday and to thank me for the lessons he's finally old enough to appreciate. Maria threw a small party with my friends from the pottery studio and the senior center, people who know me as Elena the artist, Elena the volunteer, Elena the woman who chooses joy over obligation. Roberto gave me a beautiful necklace he designed and crafted himself, a piece of jewelry made specifically for me rather than bought from a store. Miguel, his health much improved, presented me with a photo album he had assembled of our family through the years, but with a difference. He had chosen photos that showed me as the center of attention rather than always in the background serving others. Look at this woman, he said, pointing to a picture of me at Maria's wedding 5 years ago. She's beautiful and strong and deserves to be celebrated. I looked at the photograph and saw something I had missed at the time, my own radiance, the way I glowed with pride and love as I watched my daughter dance with her new husband. I had always focused on other people and family photos, seeing myself only as a supporting character in other people's stories. But in this photo, I was clearly the star. Not because I was performing or sacrificing or managing anyone else's happiness, but because I was genuinely, visibly, completely present in a moment of pure joy. That's who you've always been, Roberto told me quietly. You just finally learned how to see it. As I write this, I can hear the sounds of Northern Boulevard outside my window, the familiar urban symphony that has provided the soundtrack to my American life for more than 4 decades. The garbage trucks and car horns and distant sirens that once felt like reminders of everything I couldn't escape now sound like the heartbeat of a city full of possibilities. In a few hours, I'll go to the pottery studio for my regular Wednesday session. Tomorrow, I'll have coffee with Carmen and Ruth, comparing notes on our ungrateful children and planning our next adventure. This weekend, Roberto and I will visit the Museum of Fine Arts, something I've wanted to do for years but never made time for when I was too busy managing other people's crises. Next month, I'll travel to Mexico to visit the places my grandmother described in her stories, a trip I'm taking purely for my own pleasure and education. David has offered to contribute to the cost, not because I need his money but because he wants to be part of my happiness rather than just a drain on my resources. This is what freedom looks like at 75, a life arranged around joy rather than obligation, relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice, days filled with activities chosen for growth and pleasure rather than duty and fear. It took me 7 decades to learn that love isn't something you earn through sacrifice or lose through boundaries. Real love celebrates your happiness, respects your limits, and wants you to flourish as a complete person rather than just exist as a resource for other people's dreams. I think about all the women my age who are still trapped in the patterns I escaped, still believing that their value depends on their usefulness, still accepting disrespect because they're afraid of being alone. I want to tell them what I learned, that it's never too late to choose yourself, never too late to demand the respect you deserve, never too late to build a life that belongs entirely to you. The years I have left are mine. Not to be spent earning love I'll never receive or managing problems that aren't my responsibility, but to be lived fully, authentically, joyfully. I want to see mountains and oceans, create art that reflects my vision of beauty, build relationships based on equality rather than exploitation. I want to die knowing that I spent my final decades living for myself after spending the first 7 living for everyone else. Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where your love was measured only by your willingness to sacrifice? Have you ever loved someone so much that you forgot you deserved love in return? Have you ever discovered that saying no to unreasonable demands made you someone worth respecting rather than someone deserving punishment? Tell me your story in the comments below. Share your own journey from sacrifice to self-respect, from enablement to empowerment, from being useful to being valued. And if this story has touched something true in your own experience, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps me continue sharing stories that need to be heard, stories about the particular courage it takes to choose yourself when everyone else expects you to disappear into their needs. Because this story isn't just mine. It belongs to every person who has ever confused love with sacrifice, every parent who has enabled their children's selfishness, every person who has discovered that setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's the foundation of all genuine respect and affection. The sun is setting now behind the Queen's skyline, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that remind me why sunsets are more beautiful than sunrises. Sunsets carry the wisdom of the day, the satisfaction of hours well spent, the peaceful anticipation of rest that has been earned through living fully. I raise my cup of evening tea to all of us who have learned, finally and forever, that we are worthy of the love we have always given so freely to others. We are worthy of respect, of consideration, of relationships that nourish rather than drain us. We are worthy of happiness. And it's never too late to claim it.